I still remember the hum of the bus engine that carried me away from the city that summer. The sky outside the window looked washed in honey and gold, the kind of light that makes you feel like you're stepping into a memory rather than a place. I was 25, freshly out of college, unsure what I wanted from life, except that I wanted to breathe, to get away, to feel something that wasn't noise or deadlines. My friend Michael had invited me to stay with his family in Vermont for a few weeks. But 2 days before the trip, he called, something about a work emergency, and said he couldn't make it. His uncle Ethan, however, still wanted me to come. "You've already made plans?" Michael had said. "Uncle Ethan won't mind. He's good company. You'll like him." So, there I was, sitting on a bus headed toward someone I'd never met, my suitcase by my leg and my heart oddly restless. When I finally stepped off the bus, the air was cooler and cleaner than I'd expected. The small town lay quiet under a soft afternoon sun. A black pickup truck pulled up to the curb and a tall man stepped out. He was wearing a simple denim shirt with the sleeves rolled, hands rough but steady as he reached to shake mine. "You must be Alex," he said. His voice carried that calm warmth that makes you feel known even when you aren't. "Yes, sir," I replied awkwardly. He smiled. "Please don't call me sir. Ethan's fine." There was something grounding about the way he said my name, like he'd known it for longer than a few seconds. His eyes were calm, the kind of blue that holds both sea and storm. The drive to his house was quiet at first. The radio murmured something about summer rain, and the windows were rolled down just enough to let the wind play with my hair. I caught him glancing at me once in a while, as though measuring who I was, not in judgment but in curiosity. "Michael talks about you sometimes," Ethan said after a while. "Says you're the one who convinced him to study architecture." I laughed. "Yeah, we built imaginary houses on the school computer. He always wanted to design something that felt alive." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "He gets that from his father. Always dreaming with his hands." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full. I realized then that Ethan wasn't the kind of man who spoke to fill silence. He spoke when words were worth the air they took. When we reached his house, I felt like I'd stepped into a postcard. It was a 2-story wooden home surrounded by a wide porch, vines climbing up the beams, and a lake shimmering just beyond the trees. You could hear birds, but they didn't sound like noise, they sounded like part of the quiet. "Come on in," Ethan said, grabbing my suitcase before I could protest. "You're in the guest room upstairs. It used to be my studio, so excuse the mess." Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and coffee. The walls were lined with books and framed sketches, some landscapes, some portraits. The room he led me to had wide windows overlooking the water. The sheets were freshly folded, the sunlight laying soft stripes on them through the blinds. "This is beautiful," I said, meaning it. He smiled. "It's simple, but it grows on you." Later, over dinner, grilled salmon and vegetables he'd prepared himself, I found myself studying the way he moved around his kitchen. Confident, unhurried, like someone who had made peace with time. He asked me about my life in the city, my plans, my writing. I told him half-truths, that I was figuring things out. He didn't pry. Instead, he said, "You'll find your direction. Usually when you stop looking for it so hard." I wanted to ask how he knew that, but something in his voice told me he'd learned it the long way. After dinner, we sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The sun had dipped low, and the lake caught the last light like a mirror. I could feel the air shift, that stillness that comes right before night settles in completely. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "this place used to feel too quiet for me. Now it's the only sound I trust." I looked at him then, really looked, at the lines near his eyes, the soft edge of his beard, the faint tiredness that only comes from years of living honestly. And for reasons I couldn't name, I felt something move quietly inside me, not attraction, not yet, but a kind of recognition. Like two pieces of the same melody finally finding harmony. He caught my gaze for a moment and smiled, small, knowing, like he'd seen something in me too. "You'll get used to the quiet," he said. "It starts talking to you after a while." That night, as I lay in the guest room, I listened to the crickets outside, the faint creak of the house settling. Through the window, I could see the faint silhouette of Ethan's shadow moving downstairs, turning off lights one by one. There was something about that image, this quiet man in this quiet place, that wrapped around me like a promise I didn't yet understand. I came here expecting a summer away from noise. But as I drifted toward sleep, I realized maybe I hadn't escaped anything at all. Maybe I just stumbled into something that would change me. And though I didn't know it then, that evening was the beginning of something deeper, something that would linger long after summer was gone. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the room before I was ready for it. It came through the blinds in quiet stripes, painting golden lines across the bedspread. For a moment I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar softness of the sheets, the smell of brewed coffee drifting up from somewhere below. Then I remembered Ethan's house, the lake, the porch, his steady voice. I sat up slowly, stretching, hearing the faint chirp of birds outside. The town I came from was all sirens and chatter. Here, silence felt alive. I dressed and stepped downstairs, following the smell of coffee like it was a trail meant just for me. Ethan was already there, standing by the stove, barefoot and wearing an old gray t-shirt. He turned when he heard me. "Morning, Alex. Hope you slept well." "Like a rock," I said, though truthfully I'd woken a few times, listening to the sounds of the house breathing around me. He handed me a mug. "I make my coffee strong. You might want to add some milk." I took a sip and nearly winced. "You weren't kidding." He laughed, a low, genuine sound that warmed the room more than the sunlight did. "It grows on you." We had breakfast on the porch, toast, eggs and berries from the garden. The air smelled of wet grass and pine. Ethan sat across from me, quiet, the way people are when they've learned how to live with their thoughts. I found myself watching him again, the way he chewed slowly, the lines that deepened when he smiled, the way he didn't rush anything. "You look like you're thinking hard about something," he said, catching my gaze. "Just taking it in," I said quickly. "The quiet. It's different." He nodded. "The quiet's honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." There was something about the way he said things, like he wasn't just talking about the air or the town. Like every word had another meaning if you were brave enough to hear it. After breakfast, Ethan showed me around. The house felt lived in, books stacked 2 deep on the shelves, a few old photographs on the walls. One caught my attention. Ethan as a young man standing beside a lake, arm around someone who looked a lot like Michael's father. His smile was brighter then, freer. "You were close to Michael's dad?" I asked. He paused for a moment before answering. "He was my best friend. My brother in all the ways that matter." Something flickered in his expression, something like longing or loss, but it vanished before I could name it. Outside, the day was painted in sunlight. The lake glittered through the trees, and the air carried that faint scent of rain that never comes. Ethan handed me a spare pair of boots. "You up for a walk?" We followed a narrow trail that wound around the lake. It was quiet except for the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Every now and then he'd point out things, a type of bird, a tree with bark that peeled like paper. He seemed to notice everything without effort, as if the world spoke to him in small details. At one point we stopped by the water. Ethan skipped a stone across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. "I used to come here when I needed to think," he said softly. "It's easier to hear yourself when the world isn't shouting." I crouched beside him, picking up a flat stone. "And what do you usually hear?" He looked at me then, not the quick glance of politeness, but the steady kind that makes you feel seen. "Depends on who I'm trying to listen to." Something about that made my chest feel tight. We stayed there for a while, talking about nothing and everything, music, travel, small things that somehow felt big in that silence. I told him about my parents, my restlessness, how I felt caught between wanting to go everywhere and nowhere. He listened quietly, nodding. "You remind me of myself at your age." I kept running toward the next thing, thinking I'd find peace there. Turns out peace isn't a place. It's a moment, and it doesn't last unless you learn to notice it. I didn't know what to say, so I just looked out at the lake. For a second, I caught our reflections side by side. His calm and grounded, mine uncertain, searching. The wind brushed the surface and both rippled away. Later, back at the house, he offered to show me his small art studio at the back. "It's not much," he said, "just a hobby these days." Inside, the room smelled of paint and cedar. Sunlight slanted through a skylight, catching on unfinished canvases, landscapes mostly. But one painting stopped me, a portrait half-finished of a man's face turned toward the light. "Who's that?" I asked quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Someone I used to know." There was tenderness in the way he said it, a memory wrapped in color. I wanted to ask more but didn't. Some questions deserve silence. He offered me a brush, half joking. "Ever paint?" "Only walls," I said. He chuckled. "That's a start." We spent the rest of the afternoon there. He painted while I watched, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the soft rhythm of the brush. The air between us felt calm but charged, like the moment before rain when everything waits. When evening came, we sat again on the porch, this time with music playing softly from his phone, an old jazz tune, warm and slow. The world outside was melting into twilight, the lake turning silver under the rising moon. Ethan looked at me. You seem quieter tonight. I think your house is teaching me how, I said. He smiled at that, eyes crinkling at the corners. It's a good lesson. Most people forget how to listen. And I realized he wasn't just talking about sound, he was talking about everything. People, moments, hearts. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but like a door had opened somewhere inside me, and I didn't yet know where it led. As I turned off the lamp, I thought about the way he looked at the world, patient, kind, and full of quiet strength. I wondered what stories were hidden behind those eyes, what parts of himself he'd learned to keep still. I drifted to sleep thinking of his voice, his calmness, the reflection of the moon on the lake. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. By the third morning, the rhythm of Ethan's house had already begun to seep into me. The quiet didn't feel strange anymore, it felt like a language I was learning to understand. I woke early before the sun had fully risen. The lake outside was wrapped in mist, silver and still, as if the world hadn't yet decided to wake. From downstairs came the faint clink of dishes, Ethan already up. I found him in the kitchen, barefoot again, a soft gray hoodie pulled over his shoulders. He looked at ease, like he belonged to mornings in a way I never had. Couldn't sleep? He asked without looking up. I think I just wanted to see the sunrise, I said, though maybe that wasn't the full truth. Maybe I just wanted to see him in that light again. He handed me a mug. You're learning, he said, smiling. Strong coffee, no milk. I laughed quietly. Guess I'm adjusting. Outside, the porch glowed faintly as dawn stretched across the horizon. We sat side by side, sipping coffee in silence. The world was made of soft colors, pale blues and golds that moved like breath. It's strange, I said finally. I used to hate quiet mornings. They felt empty. Now they feel full. Ethan nodded. That's how you know you're slowing down. The stillness starts to have meaning. I watched the steam rise from his cup, the way his hands curled around the warmth. He had those hands that told stories, rough from work, steady in movement, gentle when they rested. He looked at me then, his eyes catching the early light. You think too much, Alex? Probably, I admitted. It's easier than feeling. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knows what that means. Feeling's harder. But it's the only thing that makes life honest. His words lingered long after the sound faded. Later we walked down to the lake. The morning air carried that cool sweetness that only exists for a few hours before the sun burns it away. Ethan carried a basket with 2 towels and a small thermos. You swim? He asked. Not well, I said. But I float impressively. He laughed, that warm, unguarded laugh that made the world feel lighter. Good enough. The water's cold this time of year. You'll either hate it or never want to leave. He was right. The first step into the lake was like stepping into glass, cold enough to take my breath. But when I looked up, Ethan was already waist deep, sunlight shimmering on the water around him. Come on, he said, voice echoing softly over the ripples. I took another step, then another, until the chill melted into something alive. We swam out a little, not talking, just moving through the water. When I turned back toward the shore, I saw the reflection of the two of us, distant shapes framed by the morning light. For a while we floated, letting the lake hold us. The world was all sound and silence. Water against skin, birds in the trees, the steady rhythm of breath. This place feels untouched, I said quietly. Ethan nodded, eyes half closed. It is. That's why I stay. Out there, he motioned vaguely toward the horizon. Everything's loud. Here, everything's true. Something about that stayed with me. When we came back to shore, the sun was higher, painting the world gold. We sat on the wooden dock, drying in the light. Ethan poured coffee from the thermos and handed me a cup. The warmth spread through me, chasing away the chill. Thank you, I said softly. He glanced at me. For what? For this. For letting me be here. He shrugged gently. You needed space. I have plenty to share. There was something about his simplicity that undid me, the way he gave without ceremony, cared without saying it outright. That afternoon we worked in his garden. The soil was dark and rich, the air warm. He showed me how to plant herbs properly, how not to drown them with good intentions. Patience, he said, pressing the soil gently with his fingers. Everything grows in its own time. You can't rush it. I'm not good at waiting, I admitted. He smiled. You're 25. You're not supposed to be. We spent hours like that, quiet, easy, with occasional laughter. At one point he handed me a glass of lemonade, and when our fingers brushed, a spark, small, unspoken, passed between us. He didn't move away. Neither did I. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then he smiled faintly, a little embarrassed, and looked back toward the garden. That night I couldn't sleep. The sky outside was deep blue, full of crickets and the faint rustle of wind. I got up and went to the porch where the world felt wider. Ethan was there too, sitting on the steps with a book in his hand. He looked up, surprised but not startled. Couldn't sleep either? I shook my head. Too quiet, maybe? He chuckled. You'll get used to it. It's like the sea, it hums if you listen long enough. I sat beside him, and for a while, neither of us said a word. The moonlight stretched across the lake, silver and soft. What are you reading? I asked finally. He showed me the cover, Letters to a Young Poet. I think I've heard of it, I said. You'd like it, he murmured. It's about learning to love your solitude. And trusting the slow work of time. I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere, on his voice, on how close we were sitting, on the quiet space between our breaths. He closed the book after a while and looked out over the water. When I was your age, he said softly, I thought life was something you chase. Turns out it's something you let catch you. I turned to look at him. The moonlight touched his face, gentle and silver. There was something unguarded in his expression, a kind of softness I hadn't seen before. And in that moment I understood what made him different. He wasn't trying to be anything. He simply was. When he noticed me watching, he smiled, not shyly, not boldly, but with quiet understanding. You're starting to listen, he said. To what? He tilted his head toward the lake. Everything. We stayed like that, two quiet souls under a sky full of stars, the world slowing around us. It wasn't love yet, not fully, but something like the beginning of it, gentle, unspoken, inevitable. And for the first time in years I didn't feel lost. I felt found. The days began to blend into one another, but not in the way time sometimes slips away. Here each day felt distinct, its own shade of sunlight, its own rhythm of wind and quiet laughter. Ethan and I had fallen into a pattern that felt almost accidental, though part of me wondered if he noticed it too. Mornings started with coffee, always on the porch. Afternoons were for tending to small things, fixing the garden fence, painting the window frames, or driving into town for groceries we didn't really need. Evenings belonged to the lake, when the water turned gold and the world grew still enough to hear our thoughts. I began to look forward to those small moments more than I wanted to admit. That particular evening, the sky looked heavy, clouds gathering in the distance, promising rain. Ethan was standing at the edge of the porch, arms folded, watching the horizon. I joined him quietly. Storm coming? I asked. He nodded, eyes still on the sky. It'll be here before sunset. Vermont storms don't like to keep people waiting. I smiled. Do you like them? He thought for a second, then said, I like the calm before it. And the silence after. We stood there, side by side, listening to the wind shift. A single drop landed on my hand, cool, deliberate. Within minutes, rain began to fall, soft and rhythmic, tapping on the wooden roof like fingers drumming to an old song. Ethan turned, gesturing toward the living room. Come on. You'll freeze out here. Inside, he lit a few candles. The power had flickered out, and the world outside had dissolved into gray. The air smelled like rain and cedar. I sat on the couch while he went to the kitchen, returning with 2 mugs of tea. He handed me one. Chamomile, he said. Helps calm the noise. I laughed softly. You think I'm noisy? He smiled. I think your mind is. He wasn't wrong. We sat there for a long while, the sound of rain wrapping around the house like a blanket. Every once in a while, lightning would paint the room white for a heartbeat before fading again. In those flashes, I'd catch glimpses of him. The calm curve of his mouth, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, the kind of beauty that came from stillness, not effort. At some point, I realized my heart was beating too fast for no reason at all. Do you ever get lonely here? I asked. He leaned back, eyes half on the rain. Sometimes. But loneliness isn't always a bad thing. It reminds you what matters. And what matters to you? His gaze shifted toward me then, not sharp but deep enough that I felt it somewhere beneath my ribs. Small things. Honest moments. The kind that don't need to be explained. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten a little. Like this one? He smiled softly. Maybe. Something about the way he said it, quiet, sincere, made the space between us feel charged. I wanted to look away but couldn't. There was no sound except the rain and the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. He reached out after a moment, brushing a loose thread from my sleeve. It was such a small gesture, brief, innocent, yet it felt like the whole room leaned in to watch. His fingers lingered just long enough for my breath to falter. He noticed. Sorry, he said, pulling his hand back. Old habits. I forget people can be more fragile than they look. I smiled, though my voice came out softer than I intended. I'm not fragile. He looked at me again as if testing that claim. No, he said finally, I don't think you are. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, the kind of silence that says everything words can't. When the storm eased, we stepped outside again. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and sweet with earth. The porch glistened, and the lake beyond shimmered under the dim moonlight. Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets, breathing deeply. Best part of a storm, he said quietly, is how it cleans the world. I nodded, but my eyes weren't on the lake, they were on him. The way the moonlight traced the edges of his face, the way his hair still held traces of rain. Something about him in that moment felt achingly human, imperfect, beautiful, real. He turned and caught me looking. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, that same quiet smile that always disarmed me. You're a thinker, Alex? Is that bad? No, he said. It just means you feel deeply. Most people run from that. I've been running most of my life, I admitted. And now? I hesitated, then said, now I'm learning to stand still. He looked at me a long moment, then nodded. Good. The world moves fast enough without our help. We stayed there until the moon was high, talking about small things, music, books, cities we wanted to see but never did. Every word felt like a thread being carefully woven between us. When I laughed, he laughed too, not out of politeness but out of shared warmth. And somewhere in that night, between the rain and the laughter, something shifted. Subtly, quietly. Like a tide changing direction. Later, as I lay in bed, I could still hear him downstairs, the faint scrape of a chair, the sound of him moving through the house. It comforted me in a way I didn't understand. I thought about his hand brushing my sleeve, about the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. None of it was enough to name what I was feeling, but it was enough to make me realize I didn't want to leave. That night, I wrote in my notebook. Some people arrive like weather, calm one moment, thunder the next. And before you know it, they've changed the landscape entirely. When I closed the notebook, I caught the faint reflection of my own face in the window. Behind it, the moon hung pale and bright above the lake. The same light that had touched him, the same silence that now filled me. I didn't know where this was going or if it was even supposed to go anywhere. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like the beginning of something that had already started long ago. It happened slowly, the way the sun rises. You don't see the exact moment light touches the horizon, only that one day everything looks different. Weeks had passed since that first storm. Life with Ethan had settled into something gentle, almost sacred in its rhythm. Mornings were ours, quiet, unhurried, the smell of coffee, the hum of the lake outside. Afternoons filled with small tasks, painting, fixing, tending. Evenings belonged to stories, to the soft edge of laughter that came easier than it should. And yet, beneath it all, there was a pulse. Something unsaid, steady and undeniable. One morning I caught him reading on the porch. The sun made a halo of light around him, catching in his hair. He was wearing that same old denim shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open. I stood in the doorway for longer than I should have, watching the way he turned the pages, slow, deliberate, like the world wouldn't move until he allowed it to. He looked up. You're quiet today. I smiled. I didn't want to interrupt. You never interrupt, he said. Then after a beat, you just arrive. It was such a simple thing to say, but it stayed with me. How easily he could take ordinary words and make them feel like poetry. That day he offered to take me into town. We drove with the windows down, the wind tangling our voices when we tried to talk. The local bookstore smelled of dust and time. Ethan knew everyone by name. When he introduced me, he said, "This is Alex, a friend of Michael's, staying with me for the summer." I should have expected the word friend. Still, it landed oddly, somewhere deep and tender. As we walked back to the truck, I caught my reflection in a shop window, a young man standing beside someone who seemed to carry the world's patience in his bones. For a moment, I saw us the way strangers must. Two people years apart, walking close enough that silence didn't need filling. Something inside me shifted then, a quiet knowing that had been growing unnoticed. I wasn't just fond of him. I was drawn to him in ways that made my chest feel both full and fragile. That night I found him sitting by the lake. The sky was painted with the last traces of sunset, lavender fading into blue. He looked up when he heard me, smiling like he'd been expecting me all along. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Couldn't stay inside," I said, sitting down beside him. We watched the light fade together, the water turning darker with each minute. For a while, the only sound was the gentle lap of waves against the dock. "Ethan," I said finally, "why do you live alone out here?" He took a breath before answering. "Because peace costs less when you're by yourself." I turned to him. "That sounds lonely." He shrugged lightly. "It is, sometimes. But solitude isn't the same as emptiness. It's choice. You start to see who you really are when no one's watching." I thought about that. "And who are you when no one's watching?" He smiled faintly. "Someone still trying to figure it out." There was a sadness to his words, not heavy but honest. It made me want to reach for him, to bridge whatever distance lived between us. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Maybe no one's supposed to figure it out completely." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw something like gratitude, and maybe something more. Later, when he stood to leave, his hand brushed my shoulder. A simple touch, brief and accidental, but it sent a quiet ache through me. When he was gone, I sat there long after the stars came out. The air was cool, the kind that makes your skin remember every touch. I thought of his voice, his calm, the way he made even silence feel safe. I realized then what I had been avoiding naming, that I didn't just admire him. I wanted to be near him. To know what made him smile when no one was around. To understand the quiet parts of him that he gave to no one else. And maybe, if I was honest, I wanted him to see me the same way, not as Michael's friend or a guest but as something his. The next day, everything felt different even though nothing had changed. I noticed him more, the way he hummed when he cooked, the small scar near his wrist, the way he'd glance at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, the way my chest tightened whenever he did. That evening we worked side by side in the garden. The air smelled of rain again though the sky was clear. Our shoulders brushed once, then again. He didn't move away. "Alex," he said after a while, not looking up, "you've been quiet lately." "Thinking," I said. "About?" I hesitated. "You." He stopped what he was doing, hands still in the soil. Slowly he turned toward me. The last light of day caught his face, softening the lines near his eyes. "Me?" he said gently. I nodded. "You ever think about how strange it is? How two people can meet by accident and suddenly, nothing feels the same." He studied me for a moment, too long maybe, then looked down again. "Strange," he said quietly, "and dangerous." "Why dangerous?" He pressed his palm to the earth as if grounding himself. "Because once you start feeling something you can't pretend you don't." I wanted to ask what he was feeling. But something in his voice told me I already knew. That night I couldn't write. My journal lay open on the desk, blank except for one unfinished sentence. "He speaks softly and the whole world listens." I sat by the window until late, watching the light in his room go out. I wondered if he was lying awake too, thinking about the same unspoken thing. This quiet, growing connection that neither of us had chosen, yet both of us had begun to need. And though we hadn't said it, though we might never say it, I knew. Love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it's a slow unfolding, the space between breaths, the warmth of a look held a second too long. I fell asleep to the sound of the lake, knowing something irreversible had already begun. It was one of those evenings when the air feels heavy with things unsaid. The lake was glass again, catching the faint glow of a sky that refused to turn dark. A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. Ethan was on the porch, sketchbook open on his lap. He wasn't drawing, though, just tracing slow circles on the paper with his pencil as if thinking through his hands. I watched him from the doorway for a while before stepping out. "You're missing a good sunset," I said. He smiled without looking up. "I'm trying to capture it before it disappears." I sat beside him. "Doesn't that defeat the point? Sunsets are meant to vanish." "Maybe," he said quietly. "But sometimes you try to hold the moment anyway." The way he said it made my heart shift. We both knew he wasn't only talking about light. We sat like that for a long time, the evening humming with crickets and small sounds that fill the quiet when two people stop pretending not to feel. His hand rested near mine on the bench, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin. It wasn't quite touch, but it felt like it. Finally he spoke. "You've gone quiet again these past few days." "I've been thinking," I said. "That seems to be your favorite pastime." I smiled. "Maybe. But this time it's not about what's next. It's about right now." He turned toward me, the last of the sunlight brushing across his face. "And what does right now tell you?" I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't ruin the stillness between us. "That I'm glad I came here. That you make this place feel like something more than peace." His eyes softened, but he said nothing. The silence between us deepened, gentle and full. I didn't expect this, I continued. I thought I was coming here to escape noise. Instead, I found someone who makes the quiet mean something. Ethan set the pencil down. Alex. Let me say this, I whispered. I don't know what it is between us. I just know that it feels real. And I don't want to pretend I don't feel it anymore. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment the world felt suspended. The porch light flickered as the sky turned to dusk. He took a slow breath. You're brave to say that. It doesn't feel brave. It feels necessary. Ethan leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the lake. Do you know what scares me most about being seen? He said softly. It's not being judged. It's being understood. I don't want to judge you, I said. I just want to know you. His eyes met mine again, and in that look was something fragile and bright, a quiet surrender that had been waiting for a place to land. He reached for his mug, though his hand trembled slightly before he set it aside. I've spent years building walls made of silence, he said. I thought if I kept people at a distance I'd be safe from wanting too much. And now? I asked. He smiled faintly. Now there's someone sitting next to me who keeps reminding me that wanting isn't the same as losing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind stirred, brushing against our faces like breath. Then, almost without thinking, I placed my hand over his. His fingers tightened around mine, cautious, unsure, but real. Ethan, I whispered. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. He turned our joined hands over, his thumb tracing the line of my palm as if committing it to memory. You've already changed the way the house feels, he said quietly. I didn't expect that. I smiled. Change can be good. Yes, he said. Sometimes it's the only honest thing left. The air cooled as night settled around us. The lake shimmered under a rising moon, and the candles inside the house flickered softly through the windows. Do you think things like this happen for a reason? I asked. Ethan thought for a long moment. Maybe not a reason, he said. But maybe they happen because we're finally still enough to notice them. I leaned back against the wooden rail, breathing in the scent of rain on leaves. So what now? He looked out toward the horizon. Now we keep noticing. We sat there until the first stars appeared, two quiet figures sharing the same breath of night. Nothing more was said and nothing more needed to be. When he finally stood, he touched my shoulder lightly. Good night, Alex. I caught his hand before he turned away. Good night, Ethan. For a heartbeat, we simply stood there, two people who had found something unspoken and chose not to hide it anymore. Then he gave my hand a small squeeze and went inside. That night, I lay awake, the sound of the lake drifting through the window. I replayed every word, every silence, every quiet truth that had finally found its way into the open. The confession hadn't been grand or dramatic. It was soft, the way sunlight spills into a room, barely noticed until it warms everything it touches. For the first time, I didn't feel uncertain. Whatever this was, it was real. It didn't need labels or promises, only honesty and time. I fell asleep with a smile, the echo of Ethan's voice still lingering in my mind. Now we keep noticing. And I knew I would, every glance, every pause, every quiet morning that followed, because love, I realized, doesn't always arrive in thunder. Sometimes it arrives like dawn, slow, gentle, and full of hope. Morning arrived on the hush of rain. A pale mist floated over the lake, and droplets clung to the porch rail like glass beads. When I opened my eyes, the world felt new, washed and soft, as if the night had decided to forgive everything. I found Ethan in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, making breakfast. He looked up when I entered, and the smallest smile curved his mouth. Coffee's ready, he said. Good, I answered. I'm starting to need it more than air. He poured 2 cups, slid one toward me and leaned against the counter. The comfortable silence between us felt different now, lighter, like a held breath finally exhaled. After a moment he said, Last night, what you said, it mattered. I meant every word, I replied. You didn't have to say anything back. You already did. His eyes met mine, steady and clear. I've spent so long convincing myself that quiet was safety. You reminded me that quiet can also be shared. That simple sentence settled over me like warmth. I wanted to tell him that sharing it had changed me too, that somewhere between the garden soil and the thunderstorm, I'd learned what it meant to feel at home in another person's presence. We ate breakfast at the table by the window. The rain softened, turning to a slow drizzle that blurred the edges of the world. Ethan reached across to refill my cup. His hand brushed mine, deliberate this time. We didn't pull away. What happens when the summer ends? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He smiled faintly. You're already thinking about endings. Habit, I guess. I've always looked for the exit before the door even closed. He set his mug down. Maybe this time don't. The quiet stretched between us, kind but weighty. I felt the truth of what he meant, that some things shouldn't be measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they're felt. I don't know where I'm supposed to go next, I admitted. Then stay until you do, he said simply. No clocks running. Outside, a loon called across the water, long, low, echoing. It sounded like an answer. That afternoon, the clouds broke and sunlight spilled across the porch. Ethan suggested we drive into town. We ended up at a roadside market, buying fresh bread and peaches. People waved at him, and for the first time I felt part of that rhythm instead of a visitor inside it. On the drive back, he said, You know, when Michael first told me you were coming, I thought it would be awkward. Two strangers under one roof. And now? He glanced over, smiling. Now it feels quieter when you're not in the room. I didn't know what to say. The honesty in his tone filled the truck more completely than any music could. That evening we walked along the edge of the lake. The world had turned gold again, the water catching every glint of light like a mirror. We talked about ordinary things, how the porch steps still needed sanding, how the tomatoes were finally ripening, but every word carried a thread of something unspoken and gentle. Halfway down the path he stopped and turned toward me. I keep thinking about how rare this is, he said. Two people finding the same kind of quiet at the same time. It doesn't feel rare, I said. It feels right. He looked at me for a long moment, the reflection of the lake dancing in his eyes. Then, softly, almost like a question, he reached out and took my hand. No words followed. They weren't needed. The gesture was the whole conversation. Later, back at the house, we sat on the porch again as dusk gathered. Fireflies blinked between the trees. The air carried the faint scent of mint from the garden. I used to think love was something that happened all at once, I said. Ethan smiled. And now? Now I think it's what happens when you stay long enough to notice. He nodded. Then stay. I looked out over the lake, the reflection of the moon stretching toward us like a road made of light. I will, I said. For the first time, the promise didn't feel uncertain or heavy. It felt simple, an act of choosing quietly and completely. That night, as I packed away my notebook, I wrote the final entry of the summer. Peace is not the absence of noise. It's the presence of someone who hears you even when you're silent. I closed the journal and left it on the table by the window, beside the cup he'd set down hours earlier. The candle between them flickered once before steadying, its light stretching across the room. When I went to bed, I could still hear Ethan moving softly downstairs, the sound of a door closing, of footsteps crossing the floor, of life continuing. I smiled into the dark, knowing that the days ahead would still be quiet, but never empty again. Epilogue. Weeks later, when Michael finally visited, he found us both on the porch, Ethan sketching, me writing. He grinned and said, I should have known you two would get along. Ethan met my eyes over the rim of his mug, a small, knowing smile playing at his lips. And for once I didn't look away. The lake shimmered in the late summer sun, and everything felt exactly as it should be, two lives quietly, willingly intertwined.